You're about to watch a billionaire CEO discover that the rarest thing in the world isn't loyalty money can buy, but kindness no amount of wealth can ever command. There are men so powerful they can move stock markets with a single phone call, buy skyscrapers without checking the price, and fill private hangars with jets they barely remember owning. Yet for all their power, some spend every waking day haunted by a single question. Does genuine goodness still exist? Or is every smile simply waiting for a paycheck? Arthur Pembroke was one of those men. At 76 years old, he was the billionaire CEO behind Pembroke Global Holdings, a corporate empire stretching from Manhattan to Seattle, employing tens of thousands and shaping industries most people never noticed. Business magazines called him a visionary. Rivals called him ruthless. Employees called him unpredictable. But deep inside the walls of his sprawling Boston estate, behind portraits of generations who had built fortunes brick by brick, Arthur carried a loneliness larger than every building that bore his name. On that freezing December afternoon, snow drifted quietly across the gardens outside his mansion, while warm light flickered from the marble fireplace inside his private executive library. Everything appeared peaceful. The polished walnut shelves, the antique grandfather clock marking each passing second, the leather chair positioned beside the fire where the old billionaire rested with his eyes closed, breathing slow and steady as though sleep had finally claimed him after another exhausting week. But Arthur wasn't asleep, not even close. Behind those motionless eyelids, every sense remained razor-sharp. He was waiting for another stranger to prove him right. On the mahogany table within easy reach rested an unsealed envelope containing $5,000 in crisp $100 bills. A few notes intentionally peeked over the edge as though an aging executive had simply forgotten where he placed them. It wasn't an accident. It never was. Arthur called it the conscience test. Over the past 20 years, dozens had unknowingly faced it. Contractors, assistants, gardeners, delivery drivers, temporary staff. Every single one had eventually glanced toward the money. Most hesitated. Some looked around first. Others reached immediately. But sooner or later, every person disappointed him. Every failure added another brick to the invisible wall surrounding his heart. He no longer tested people hoping to find honesty. He tested them hoping to confirm that trust was foolish. Somewhere deep inside, the man who had once believed in people had quietly disappeared. Then the library door eased open with barely a whisper. Arthur heard soft footsteps enter, careful, measured, almost apologetic. They weren't the heavy shoes of an executive or the hurried pace of a maintenance worker. They belonged to someone trained to move without disturbing anyone. A young black waitress stepped carefully into the room, carrying a silver tray against her hip. Her name was Naomi Brooks, 26 years old, working her third double shift this week after volunteering to cover another employee who had called in sick. She wasn't supposed to be inside the private library at all. Her only assignment was to deliver a fresh pot of coffee requested for the executive meeting scheduled later that afternoon. She glanced toward the sleeping billionaire CEO, then quietly toward the forgotten envelope resting beside his hand. Arthur silently counted the seconds, already convinced he knew exactly how this story would end. He had absolutely no idea that before the sun set, the woman standing only a few feet away would shatter 20 years of bitterness with nothing more than one simple act of humanity. Naomi stopped beside the table without making a sound. Years of working in luxury restaurants had taught her that the wealthiest guests valued silence almost as much as perfect service. She carefully placed the silver coffee pot on the warming tray, adjusted the porcelain cup until its handle pointed exactly where a right hand would naturally reach, and glanced once more toward the elderly man sleeping beside the fireplace. His breathing seemed deep, slow, almost peaceful. She smiled faintly. He looked less like the feared billionaire CEO from magazine covers, and more like someone's tired grandfather who had simply worked too many years without enough rest. Then her eyes drifted toward the thick envelope. $5,000. Maybe more. She could not know for certain, but she recognized fresh $100 bills the same way every server in America eventually learned to recognize them. For just a heartbeat, she froze. That amount of money could erase 3 months of overdue rent. It could repair the transmission in her aging Honda Civic that rattled every morning before finally starting. It could pay for another semester of the evening business classes she had been taking one course at a time because it was all she could afford. The temptation was real, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. But temptation and decision were never the same thing. Naomi quietly looked away. Money that did not belong to her had never been an option. Her grandmother had repeated one lesson, so often it became part of her heartbeat. If your peace can be bought, then it was never yours to begin with. Naomi believed that with every part of herself. She reached for the coffee service again when something else caught her attention. A leather portfolio resting dangerously close to the edge of the table had begun to slide toward the hardwood floor. The polished surface beneath it was smooth enough that another inch would send it crashing down. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, gently lifted the portfolio with both hands, brushed away a speck of dust with her sleeve, and placed it securely beside the lamp. The envelope remained exactly where it had been, untouched except that she nudged it slightly farther from the edge so neither item could accidentally fall. Arthur felt every tiny movement through nearly closed senses. He waited for the unmistakable sound of paper being lifted, folded, hidden. It never came. Instead, he heard only the soft scrape of leather returning safely to polished wood. Confusion crept into his carefully controlled thoughts. Perhaps she was waiting until she believed he had fallen into deeper sleep. He remained perfectly still. Another minute passed. Then another. Naomi quietly folded the linen napkin beneath the coffee service. Noticing the room felt cooler than the rest of the mansion. The enormous windows overlooking the snowy gardens allowed faint drafts to slip inside despite the glowing fireplace. She glanced toward Arthur again. His hands rested outside the blanket draped across the chair. The skin looked pale. His fingers barely moved. She frowned almost instinctively. People often assumed wealthy men never experienced discomfort because money insulated them from ordinary problems. But Cole did not care about net worth. Age did not recognize bank accounts. Exhaustion ignored job titles. She slowly removed the charcoal gray cardigan she had worn beneath her uniform while commuting through the freezing Boston streets that morning. It was inexpensive, slightly faded at the sleeves, and the only warm layer she had brought to work. Holding her breath, she stepped closer, carefully unfolded it, and gently covered Arthur's hands and knees without disturbing his apparent sleep. Then, almost whispering to herself, she murmured, "My grandmother always said nobody should be left cold, especially someone who has forgotten to ask for help." Arthur's heartbeat stumbled for the first time in years. Arthur kept his breathing slow, but inside his carefully guarded mind, something had begun to shift. He had expected curiosity. He had expected hesitation. He had even expected calculation. What he had not expected was sacrifice. The cardigan resting across his knees carried the faint scent of clean cotton and winter air. It was still warm from Naomi's shoulders. She had not covered him with something extra. She had covered him with the only warmth she had. For several long seconds, she simply stood there, making certain the fabric would not slide away before quietly stepping back toward the serving cart. She never looked at the envelope again. She only checked that the coffee was still hot enough to serve the meeting that would begin later that afternoon. Arthur's thoughts became unusually loud. Why would someone earning little more than hourly wages give away her only layer of warmth to a man whose closet probably contained more cashmere coats than she had owned jackets in her entire life? The question refused to leave him. It reminded him of another winter many years earlier, before bitterness had become his closest companion. His late wife, Beatrice, used to stop the car whenever she saw someone stranded in the snow. She never asked who they voted for, what neighborhood they came from, or whether they deserved help. She simply said the cold does not ask questions before it arrives. Arthur had admired that kindness once. Then life had convinced him kindness belonged only in stories. Naomi finished arranging the silver tray before quietly walking toward the doorway. Just as her fingers reached the brass handle, another voice echoed down the hallway. "Naomi, are you in there?" It was Evelyn Marsh, the estate hospitality manager. Her tone carried concern more than frustration. Naomi opened the door only halfway. "Yes, Miss Marsh. The coffee has been delivered." Evelyn glanced past her into the library and immediately noticed the cardigan covering Arthur's lap. Her eyes widened. "What did you do?" she whispered. Naomi instinctively looked back at the sleeping executive. "The room felt cold," she answered softly. His hands looked freezing. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment. You cannot leave personal belongings in the chairman's private library. If he wakes up and thinks someone touched him without permission, this could become a serious problem. Naomi's face lost a little color. I did not mean any disrespect. I only wanted him to stay warm. Evelyn sighed. She had supervised luxury hospitality for nearly 30 years and understood exactly how quickly good intentions could be misunderstood around powerful people. Take it back before he notices, she urged quietly. Naomi hesitated. She looked once more toward Arthur, whose hands now rested comfortably beneath the soft gray fabric. Outside, snow continued drifting across the tall windows while the wind tapped gently against the glass. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice again. If helping someone becomes inconvenient, that is the very moment kindness proves whether it is real. Naomi slowly shook her head. I would rather explain why I covered him than explain why I left him cold. Those words settled over the room with surprising weight. Arthur felt them more deeply than he wanted to admit. They were not dramatic. They were not rehearsed. They carried the quiet certainty of someone whose values had survived hardship without becoming bitterness. Evelyn studied Naomi for another moment before giving the smallest nod. Then let us hope he understands. The two women quietly disappeared into the hallway, leaving the library wrapped once again in silence. Arthur remained motionless in the chair, but the certainty he had carried into this afternoon had begun to crack. For the first time in 2 decades, the billionaire CEO found himself hoping the next part of his test would prove him wrong instead of right. Arthur waited until the hallway fell completely silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock returned, steady and patient, filling the room with the kind of quiet that forces a person to listen to thoughts they have avoided for years. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he opened one eye just enough to see the gray cardigan still resting across his knees. It was neatly folded despite having been placed there in haste. The sleeves were slightly worn, one cuff carefully stitched by hand where the fabric had once torn. It was not expensive. It had been repaired because replacing it had probably never been an option. Arthur gently touched the sleeve with 2 fingers before quickly closing his eyes again as footsteps echoed from the corridor. He was no longer pretending for the same reason. Earlier that afternoon, he had wanted proof that people were selfish. Now he wanted proof that Naomi had simply made a mistake, that kindness had been accidental, that his understanding of the world had not been built on 20 years of lies. The library door opened once more. Naomi returned carrying a small tray with fresh cream and sugar requested for the upcoming executive meeting. She moved with the same quiet professionalism as before, replacing the silver pitcher without disturbing a single item on the polished table. The envelope remained exactly where Arthur had left it, thick with crisp bills waiting like silent bait. She stood beside it for several seconds while adjusting the coffee service. Her fingertips came within inches of the money. Arthur could almost feel his own pulse. Then Naomi noticed something else. One of the framed photographs sitting beside the fireplace had tilted slightly to one side. It showed Arthur many years younger standing beside a smiling woman overlooking the Boston Harbor. Naomi gently straightened the frame until it rested perfectly level. She studied the photograph for only a moment before whispering so quietly that she believed no one could hear. She looks like she made you smile. Arthur's chest tightened beneath the blanket. No employee had spoken about Beatrice in years. Most of the younger staff did not even know her name. Naomi smiled softly toward the photograph itself. I hope someone still remembers to tell you good morning. She reached toward the envelope, and Arthur instinctively prepared himself for disappointment. Instead, she slid the money farther away from the edge of the table so it would not accidentally fall when the executives arrived. Then she carefully aligned it beside the leather portfolio she had already rescued earlier, almost as though both deserved equal care simply because they belonged to someone else. She quietly picked up the empty tray and turned toward the door. Before leaving, she looked once more at Arthur sleeping peacefully in the chair. "Stay warm, sir," she whispered. "Somebody is probably waiting for you to wake up, even if you do not know it yet." The door closed behind her with barely a sound. Arthur remained perfectly still, but inside him an old memory surfaced with painful clarity. The last winter before Beatrice passed away, she had smiled at him from her hospital bed and said, "Promise me one thing. Never become so successful that you stop believing there are good people." He had promised without hesitation. He had also failed her completely. The realization settled over him heavier than the cardigan covering his knees. Perhaps the greatest lie he had ever believed was not that people were dishonest. Perhaps it was that disappointment had given him permission to stop looking for goodness altogether. For the first time since beginning his private tests 2 decades earlier, Arthur quietly admitted something to himself that he had never allowed before. The examination was no longer about Naomi. It had become a test of the man he himself had become. The executive meeting began 30 minutes later. Senior vice presidents, legal advisors, and board members filed quietly into the library, each carrying polished folders and expensive watches that reflected the glow of the fireplace. None of them noticed the gray cardigan resting across Arthur's knees. They were too busy reviewing quarterly reports, acquisition proposals, and numbers large enough to change headlines by morning. Arthur opened his eyes at precisely the right moment, stretching as though he had awakened naturally from an afternoon nap. "Good afternoon," he said calmly. Every conversation stopped. Chairs shifted. Greetings filled the room. Arthur acknowledged each executive with a nod before allowing his gaze to drift almost casually toward the coffee service. Everything stood exactly where it should. The silver pot gleamed. The porcelain cups were perfectly aligned. The leather portfolio rested safely beside the lamp. And the envelope remained untouched. Arthur looked toward Evelyn Marsh. "Who prepared the room?" Evelyn hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Naomi Brooks delivered the coffee, sir." Arthur nodded slowly. "Please ask her to come here." Across the estate, Naomi was polishing glassware in the main dining hall when Evelyn quietly approached. The older woman offered a reassuring smile, but worry lingered behind her eyes. "Mr. Pembroke would like to see you in the library." Naomi felt her stomach tighten. She immediately thought of the cardigan. Perhaps someone had noticed after all. She removed her apron, smoothed the sleeves of her uniform, and followed Evelyn through the long hallway lined with oil paintings and marble columns. Every step seemed louder than the last. By the time she reached the library doors, her palms had grown cold despite the warmth inside the mansion. She gently knocked. "Come in," Arthur called. Naomi entered with quiet professionalism, careful not to interrupt the executives seated around the polished conference table. Dozens of eyes turned toward her at once. She stood near the doorway with calm posture, even though uncertainty pressed against her chest. Arthur studied her without speaking. The silence stretched just long enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, "Miss Brooks, did you enter this room before the meeting?" "Yes, sir," Naomi answered honestly. "Did you touch anything?" Every executive looked toward the envelope. Naomi followed their eyes and immediately understood what they were thinking. She could have defended herself. She could have explained the portfolio, the photograph, the coffee service. Instead, she simply answered, "Yes, sir. I moved your portfolio because it was about to fall. I straightened the photograph beside the fireplace. I adjusted the envelope so it would not slide off the table. And," she paused briefly before continuing with complete honesty, "I placed my cardigan over you because your hands looked cold." A few executives exchanged surprised glances. Someone quietly cleared his throat. Arthur kept his expression unreadable. "Did anyone give you permission to do that?" Naomi lowered her eyes respectfully. "No, sir." "Then why did you do it?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Because sometimes doing the right thing arrives before permission does. I believed you needed warmth more than I needed approval." The room became perfectly still. Arthur looked around the conference table at men and women who negotiated billion-dollar contracts for a living. None of them spoke. None of them had expected the youngest employee in the mansion to answer with such quiet certainty. Arthur slowly reached down, lifted the gray cardigan from his lap with both hands, and carefully folded it along the stitched sleeve she had repaired herself. Then he stood, walked across the library, and stopped directly in front of Naomi. Without a word, he held the cardigan out toward her, but instead of letting go immediately, he asked one final question. "Tell me, Miss Brooks, if you had known exactly who I was before you covered me, would you have done anything differently?" Naomi accepted the cardigan with both hands, smoothing the worn fabric almost instinctively before answering. "No, sir," she said quietly. "Knowing your title would not have changed the temperature of your hands." A faint murmur moved around the conference table before disappearing just as quickly. Arthur continued watching her, searching for hesitation, calculation, or the slightest attempt to impress him. He found none. Her answer had come too quickly to be rehearsed and too simply to be manipulative. It carried the effortless honesty of someone who had never expected to be rewarded for doing the right thing. Arthur slowly returned to his chair without breaking eye contact. "You may answer one more question," he said. "When you saw that envelope on the table, did you ever think about taking it?" Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn lowered her gaze. Naomi could have denied it immediately, but she did not. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Yes, sir. I thought about what $5,000 could do for my life." Arthur leaned forward slightly. "Go on." "It could have paid my overdue rent. It could have repaired my car. It could have covered another semester of school." For a few seconds I imagined every problem becoming smaller. She paused before adding, "But then I remembered something my grandmother taught me. She used to say that money can solve many problems, but stolen peace follows you everywhere." I decided I would rather keep my peace. Arthur remained silent. There was something strangely refreshing about hearing temptation admitted instead of denied. Honest people were not those who never faced difficult choices. Honest people simply chose correctly when nobody else was watching. He reached into his suit jacket and slowly removed the thick envelope. Several executives immediately recognized it. A few exchanged knowing looks. They had seen versions of Arthur's private experiments before, although none had ever spoken about them openly. Arthur held the envelope in one hand while looking directly at Naomi. "This money was never forgotten," he said. "It was placed there intentionally." Confusion appeared across Naomi's face. Arthur continued, "For 20 years I have left cash where employees could find it. I convinced myself that every person eventually reveals who they truly are when enough money is involved." Silence settled over the library once again. Naomi looked from Arthur to the envelope and back again as understanding slowly dawned. "You were testing people," she said softly. Arthur nodded once. "Yes." She lowered her eyes, not in shame but in quiet disappointment. "That must be exhausting." The words landed harder than any accusation. Arthur blinked. "What do you mean?" Naomi answered with gentle sincerity. "Living every day expecting people to fail, you must become very lonely after a while." Nobody in the room moved. The board members who negotiated billion-dollar mergers suddenly found themselves listening to a conversation worth far more than any quarterly report. Arthur realized that she had not criticized him. She had pitted him. That realization reached somewhere deeper than pride. He looked down at the envelope in his hand before speaking almost to himself. "I believe the world had become dishonest." Naomi offered the smallest smile. "Sometimes the world is simply waiting for someone willing to believe in it first." Arthur felt something inside him begin to loosen, something that had remained locked away since the day he buried his wife. For the first time in many years, the envelope no longer looked like evidence that people could not be trusted. It looked like proof that he had almost missed the very goodness he had spent decades searching for. Arthur looked at the envelope for several long seconds before extending it toward Naomi. "Take it," he said quietly. She did not move. "No, sir." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "You have not even asked how much is inside." Naomi answered with the same calm certainty she had shown since walking into the library. "The amount does not change the answer." A few executives exchanged surprised glances. Arthur gently shook the envelope. "This is not payment for serving coffee." "I understand. It is not charity either." "I understand that too." Arthur stepped closer. "Then why refuse?" Naomi smiled politely. "Because if I accept it today, I will spend the rest of my life wondering whether I was rewarded for my honesty or whether my honesty was purchased. I would rather remember today without asking myself that question." The room fell silent once again. Arthur slowly lowered the envelope. In all his years of building companies, negotiating acquisitions, and managing fortunes measured in billions, he had rarely met someone who understood the difference between value and price so instinctively. "What do you want then?" he asked. Naomi thought for only a moment. "To keep working honestly. To finish business school one class at a time. To build something of my own someday." Arthur studied her expression. There was no bitterness, no resentment toward people wealthier than herself. Only quiet determination. "What would you build?" Naomi looked toward the snow falling beyond the tall windows. "A neighborhood cafe." Several executives seemed puzzled by the simplicity of the answer. Naomi continued, "Not just a cafe. A place where elderly people who live alone can drink coffee without feeling invisible. Somewhere college students can study without buying expensive meals. Somewhere every customer is greeted by name before they are greeted by the menu. My grandmother used to say people remember how a place makes them feel long after they forget what they ordered. Arthur listened without interrupting. He realized she was not describing a business. She was describing a community. Did your grandmother raise you? He asked. Naomi nodded. After my parents passed away. She worked as a hotel housekeeper for almost 40 years. She never had much money, but she believed generosity was not measured by what people gave away. It was measured by what they refused to let hardship take from their hearts. Arthur felt his throat tighten. Those words echoed something Beatrice had once whispered years before. Different voices. Same truth. He slowly walked back to the conference table and placed the unopened envelope in the center. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, looking around at every executive in the room. We have spent the last 2 hours discussing investments, market forecasts, and expansion strategies. He rested one hand lightly on the envelope. Not one of those conversations has taught me as much as the last 15 minutes. Nobody disagreed. Arthur turned toward Naomi once more. Miss Brooks, I cannot force you to accept this money. Thank you, sir. But I hope you will allow me to ask you one favor. Naomi tilted her head slightly. What kind of favor? Arthur's voice softened in a way none of his executives had ever heard before. Do not leave this estate yet. I believe my meeting today has only just begun, and strangely enough, you may be the most important person in the room. For the first time since entering the library, genuine surprise appeared across Naomi's face. She had expected criticism, perhaps even dismissal. She had never imagined that the billionaire CEO who had spent decades testing everyone around him would quietly become the one asking for another chance. The board meeting ended differently than anyone expected. Charts remained unopened. Financial projections stayed on the conference table untouched. One by one, the executives quietly gathered their folders, offering respectful nods before leaving the library without their usual discussions about profits or deadlines. The room that normally echoed with billion-dollar decisions now held only Arthur, Naomi, Evelyn, and the fading crackle of the fireplace. Arthur walked toward the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, his hands folded behind his back. For several moments, he simply watched the white landscape without speaking. Finally, he broke the silence. Do you know why I began testing people? Naomi answered honestly. No, sir. Arthur nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer. 20 years ago, my wife, Beatrice, passed away after a long illness. She was the kindest person I ever knew. Before she died, she made me promise that I would never allow grief to harden my heart. His reflection stared back from the glass, older than he remembered. I broke that promise. Naomi remained silent. Some stories deserve space before they deserve replies. Arthur continued. After the funeral, my own children argued about inheritance before the flowers had even wilted. Trusted employees stole from the company. Business partners smiled during meetings and betrayed contracts the following week. Every disappointment convinced me kindness belonged only to people who had never been tested. He turned slowly toward Naomi. Eventually, I stopped looking for good people. I only looked for proof that everyone had a price. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking. Pain is a convincing teacher. Arthur gave a quiet smile. Yes, perhaps too convincing. He walked to a bookshelf and carefully removed a silver-framed photograph of Beatrice. She stood beside a lighthouse overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, her scarf caught by the wind, smiling with effortless warmth. Arthur gently brushed a finger across the glass. She used to embarrass me, he admitted with a soft chuckle. She donated anonymously. She volunteered without telling anyone. She always believed that the greatest acts of kindness happened when cameras were nowhere nearby. Naomi looked at the photograph with genuine admiration. She sounds remarkable. Arthur nodded. She would have liked you. Those simple words carried more weight than any compliment Naomi had received in years. She smiled, although her eyes shimmered slightly. I wish I could have met her. Arthur carefully returned the photograph to its place before walking back toward the conference table. He picked up the unopened envelope once more, then placed it inside a drawer instead of offering it again. Perhaps money was never the lesson, he said quietly. Perhaps I kept using the wrong test. Naomi tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Arthur looked directly at her. I spent 20 years measuring honesty by whether someone would take $5,000. He paused before adding, "Today you reminded me that real character is measured by what people choose to give away instead." Evelyn felt tears gathering in her eyes as she quietly excused herself, leaving the two of them alone. Snow continued falling outside, covering the gardens in fresh white layers that erased old footprints one by one. Arthur noticed the worn stitching along Naomi's cardigan again. "Tell me something," he said gently. "If someone offered to help you without asking for anything in return, would accepting that help make you feel weak?" Naomi considered the question carefully before answering. "No, sir. Accepting kindness is not weakness. Forgetting to pass it forward would be." Arthur closed his eyes for just a second. Somewhere deep inside, a promise he had broken 20 years earlier was beginning to breathe again. Arthur walked slowly toward the fireplace, resting one hand against the carved oak mantel as though steadying himself against something far heavier than age. The flames reflected across the polished marble, throwing warm light over the room that had witnessed 20 years of suspicion and, in the span of a single afternoon, the beginning of something entirely different. Naomi remained quietly where she stood, never assuming the conversation was over simply because the silence had returned. She had learned long ago that some of the most important moments in life arrived after everyone stopped speaking. Arthur finally turned back toward her. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I would like you to meet me at corporate headquarters." Naomi blinked in surprise. "Sir, 9 o'clock. Executive floor." She hesitated. "I do not work there. I am aware of that." His voice carried the faintest trace of humor. Yet, Naomi looked genuinely confused. "With respect, sir, I am a waitress." Arthur nodded. "Yes, and before today, I believe titles explain people. Apparently, they do not." He walked back to the conference table and picked up a leather notebook that Naomi had quietly rescued from falling earlier that afternoon. "Do you know what this is?" She shook her head. "Every major acquisition I have approved during the last 15 years began inside this notebook. Every company I believed in, every executive I promoted, every investment that built this corporation." He held it gently between both hands. "You saved it without knowing what it contained. You protected it because it belonged to someone else, not because you expected recognition." Naomi smiled softly. It was sliding off the table. Arthur gave a slow nod. "Exactly." He looked down for a moment before continuing. "Character often reveals itself in the smallest decisions. People imagine integrity appears during extraordinary moments. It usually appears when nobody believes the decision matters." Naomi listened quietly. The words felt less like a lecture and more like a confession. Arthur continued, "Tomorrow I am assembling a small advisory group to evaluate a new community investment initiative. Lawyers will be there, financial analysts, marketing executives. I would like you to attend." Naomi almost laughed from disbelief. "Sir, I have never attended a board meeting. Neither had anyone before attending their first." She looked uncertain. "I would not know what to say." Arthur smiled for the first time that day, without sadness hiding behind it. "That is precisely why I want you there. Everyone else knows how to discuss profit. I need someone who still knows how to discuss people." Those words settled into the quiet room with remarkable clarity. Naomi thought about her grandmother, about years spent carrying trays between crowded dining tables, remembering regular customers by name, listening to lonely widowers talk because nobody else had asked how they were doing. None of those experiences appeared on a resume. Yet somehow Arthur seemed to value them more than the impressive credentials decorating executive offices across the city. She took a slow breath. "If I come, I will speak honestly." Arthur answered without hesitation. "I would consider anything less a disappointment." A gentle smile crossed Naomi's face. "Then I will be there." Arthur extended his hand, not as a billionaire CEO acknowledging an employee, but as one human being thanking another. Naomi accepted the handshake. His hands were still cool, though no longer as cold as they had been that afternoon. "One more thing," Arthur said quietly. "Please keep wearing that cardigan." Naomi glanced down at the carefully stitched sleeve and smiled. "It has seen better days." Arthur looked at it with unexpected respect. Perhaps, but today it reminded an old man that warmth has never depended on expensive fabric. It has always depended on the heart of the person willing to share it.